I'm going to start. First, people know me, I think, but I'll go and introduce everybody, and then you can jump in if there's anything I missed. Phil is an old friend, and his fund, Sozo Ventures, is kind of a unique fund in that it invests globally, but with a strong presence in Silicon Valley. But their, I'd say, focus is large Japanese investors that invest in their fund, and they also help these companies understand entrepreneurship. And now Phil is spending more and more time trying to unlock Japan rather than just entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. And Phil used to, did you start the Kauffman Fellows program? Kauffman? Or you were?
I was in the first class, but I didn't.
You were in the first class. And the Kauffman Fellows is a fellowship that helps people become venture capitalists. And so, and Phil has written many books on venture capital and teaches a course on entrepreneurship at Stanford. And I think you're giving away copies of your book. It's in Japanese though, right? It's in Japanese, as he says in English. But
you can't get coffee there, but you can get a book.
You can get a book. So, so pick up Phil's book. And recently you've been doing conferences in Japan about unlocking entrepreneurship. So we'll talk about entrepreneurship in general. So Sho is not related to me, and neither is Masumi. But Sho is, works in the cabinet office and has been working on startups for a long time. And we're working together on the Global Startup Campus project. And Sho is quite unique in the government. He's kind of an entrepreneur in the government. And is loved by many and also feared by many because he's entrepreneurial. And Masumi recently was at MIT studying entrepreneurship in Japan. That was one of your foci, and she worked on entrepreneurship, but now she's working on space policy. Is that correct? And then Battushig is probably quite unique on this panel. So I think you were like 16 or something. I think he was a teenager when so MIT opened up online courses, and there was one outlier where there was a kid somebody from Mongolia that got a perfect score in the circuits course, which is one of the hardest courses at MIT. So they invited him in. Were you 16 or something? 15? 15. And they said, oh, you should go to MIT. So Battushig got recruited at 15 to go to MIT, and he graduated from MIT. I think he went to Apple and worked on AI. And for some reason, he's here in Japan doing a startup. And he's sort of exhibit A of the difficulties of being a startup entrepreneur in Japan. So he has both the MIT perspective as well as sort of a non-Japanese trying to do a startup in Japan. And the panel is entrepreneurship in Japan, which is kind of broad because entrepreneurship, I think, can include entrepreneurship in government or entrepreneurship as a researcher or startups. But I think we can cover it generally. But maybe we should sort of define what entrepreneurship is. I don't know, Phil, since you teach it, maybe you can explain it.
Well, I actually teach venture capital, but I've been around entrepreneurs. I kind of know what it is. The way we frame it in the class in capital formation is the entrepreneurship piece. You can look at the traditional French definition, which I think is the shifting of resources from areas of low opportunity to high opportunity. And so you can see entrepreneurs inside universities, inside governments, inside corporations. I like that definition. When you get into the science of what Battushig, am I pronouncing that right? Okay. What he's actually doing and created a company, I think, is much narrow. And I wouldn't make it more complicated than product market fit and unit economics that are highly scalable. Like that's the focus of what an entrepreneur should be building. And what we teach in capital formation is the design and nourishment of fast growth organizations. So we think those two go hand in hand. So that's how I would think about it. I don't think about it when I hear the word entrepreneurship. I don't think you're necessarily creating a company, but that's usually what it looks like.
I mean, would it just trying to rephrase it? So would it be though, kind of unlocking an opportunity by looking at some structural change you could make through a product or anything else that sort of moves resources into a more efficient place that it should?
Yeah, I would. The way I converse with my students on it is what opportunity are you obsessed about, who does that opportunity go through, and what have you done to learn whether that person or that entity is interested in your idea. So it begins with that obsession, and then it does unlock an opportunity. And I think great entrepreneurs, an opportunity is kind of halfway there, and the great entrepreneurs sort of go and meet it and pull it forward in time. It's percolating, but it won't happen without the great entrepreneur to kind of to congeal it.
And I think one of the things that Sho is working on, I think Battushig represents a little bit, is technology entrepreneurship. And I think when I was at the Media Lab, one of the unique things about the Media Lab was we had a lot of outside people talking to us about whether this technology was actually useful or not. And so I think a lot of, and we used the term antidisciplinary earlier, but a lot of disciplines are about going deeper and deeper about more and more kind of societally irrelevant stuff, right? And I think that to be able to kind of tie it back into, well, how does this affect the world? How does this change resource allocation? I think so for deep tech, there's kind of the connection to something that might be theoretically interesting to something that's practically useful, right?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's at Stanford, you hear a lot of professors in entrepreneurship classes talk about the danger of breathing your own fumes and sitting inside a room with your team and thinking how great this idea is, and a lot of them just force you out into the marketplace.
Like all large institutions. I don't know if anybody want to add to, and we'll tie it to Japan, but just entrepreneurship in general. I don't know if anybody wants to talk more.
So from government perspective, so we've been pushing a lot for startup policies in the past, especially like 10 years and 5 years, and especially this is important to figure out the social issues and also for the national growth. And what's important thing is like entrepreneurship for each like individual, like a person or researchers or like a student, and to achieve their mission and to have companies. And especially from government perspective, we want to have more of startups, and we want to have more of entrepreneurs, we say. And so I think one of the differences between like Phil's view and like a general Japanese people's view is almost like entrepreneurship is already like embedded in like for many like US like entrepreneurs or like founders, but in Japan it's not so common. And from policy perspective, like how to like foster more of entrepreneurial culture and how to change people's mindset, like a risk-taking culture, and like a setting like a specific target and think about how to get there. And how to unlock, the important thing is you should not like draw your line or limitation by yourself, and you just think about how to get like achieve the target. And but that's not so like easy to do that in Japan. And we've been thinking about like how to change this culture and how to, and we need to think about like a Japanese way of doing that. Yeah, sorry.
Just wanted to add more thing. In my experience of building a companies, entrepreneurship is about innovation and a lot of things. But what I personally discovered was that it's about aligning interests, because world has enough resources to solve most problems. And the reason why that the problem exists is because the parties that is necessary to solve that problem usually has a misaligned incentives mechanisms. And the entrepreneur's job is to actually come up with the ways to align their incentives through using technology or through building a narrative or through building a movement so that the respective parties' incentives become aligned and that problem becoming a solution. So like, to me, entrepreneurship is about aligning incentives and interests, and how do you do that is what I always think about.
Just adding to the Sho-san's point, from the government perspective view, since I am doing spice policy, we recognize it is really important to make a lot of startups like coming into our space area, because we from the industrial policy view, it is the only way to expand industrial base. Like old companies are sometimes very slow, and startup can like bring a new perspective and make things happen very quickly. So entrepreneurship is really important from that perspective as well.
Interesting. I saw a post by Emily Parker, who's a friend on LinkedIn the other day, and it said in China, I don't remember the Chinese phrase, but there's a phrase that entrepreneurs use that says, there's always a way, which is pretty cool because I think in Japan, it's a lot of it is about that, no, that sounds pretty rude. You know, I mean, I think that there's usually a reason why you can't do it. But then I think, and risk as well, I mean, I think a key thing about an entrepreneurship, in my view, is that you buy low, sell high. With you're a venture capitalist, you invest when it's risky, and when everyone else thinks it's not risky anymore is when you sell. But Japanese tend to buy high, sell low. So they buy Rockefeller Center when it's the most expensive, and they sell it when it's the cheapest because they try to buy things with no risk and sell things that are risky. And you can never, and that's sort of the opposite. But it's not always been that way, right? I think post-war Japan, or just around that period, you had Toyota and Sony and Panasonic and Honda. So I think it's also a lot has to do with kind of the phase that you're in, the age of the society, and so I'm curious, that there's this idea that Japanese aren't entrepreneurial, right? And I think, and I know that Masumi said you did some studies on students and Japanese becoming entrepreneurs, but I mean, is that true, first of all? And do you try to change it, or do you try to adapt entrepreneurship to Japan? I mean, what's the right way forward for entrepreneurship in Japan? I know everybody's been working on it. Maybe Masumi-san can give the highlight.
Yeah, I think it is correct. Like depending on what phase of ages you are in, I think the required entrepreneurship mind might be different. And nowadays, we are living in the difficult age where a lot of social challenges is evolving. So maybe in terms of that we have more and more challenges now compared to the post-war world. So from that perspective, it might be maybe easier, more and more opportunity compared to the past. Yeah.
So the difficulty of the environment is creating opportunity for entrepreneurship because we need change.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean,
I have a couple thoughts on that. So words like risk or words like failure, when I hear people use them, I usually don't always stop the conversation. So what do you mean by risk? And I think when you do that, I think if we just had everybody input their definition of risk in this room with 100 people, we might get 50 definitions. So I think that I would argue that the Japanese view of risk or definition of risk is not helpful, because I think risky is something can go, something cannot work, and I wouldn't say that's risk. Risk is when something bad happens that you're not prepared for. That's the scary part. So if you do a startup and it doesn't work, I wouldn't say that is a risk. I would say the way that you run the startup, if you run it in the wrong way, if you run it poorly, if you run it unethically, then you're going to find that you've got a problem, and that you could characterize as a failure. But we've seen many examples of companies that just didn't quite get there in time, but they're either able to pull something out of the near wreckage, like a Slack, right? Everybody knows Slack did not start as a messaging company. It started as a gaming company, right? And I think Stuart's on his third gaming company now. He's turned the first two into other things that were successful. So I think it's just these ideas around failure and risk and words like this that create a lot of rigidity in Japan. If you don't think there's creativity here, look at areas where there's freedom to operate, like architecture, like literature, like film and games and everything. Some of those creative minds in the world coming out of Japan. I just think the system is too rigid, and it doesn't allow the creatives in business anywhere to go. So they all end up in Silicon Valley.
I mean, just to tie it to the earlier panel, I don't know if you saw it, but we were talking about antidisciplinary and academic rigor. And I think one of the first things that I learned when I got to MIT was science works because you make what's called a falsifiable claim. So you make a claim, this is maybe true, and then you have to create a test that determines if it's true or not. And the test has to include how do you know if it's true or not, and then you turn over that card, and it's either true or not. And what was interesting for me, especially at the Media Lab, like half of the conversation started out, well, it turns out that, which means I was wrong, but here's this cool thing that I learned, right? And what you were trying to do was learn. You weren't trying to be right. And that if you constructed the test well, you learned something really interesting, whether it was right or not. And I think the other thing with startups is that you have to instrument to learn, right? Because if you fail and all it is, oh my God, I failed. It's like, it turns out that it's not this way, but it's this way. And I feel like the scientific method as well as Silicon Valley entrepreneurship is designed to turn risk-taking into learning. Whereas in Japan, like when I go to a government agency and I see a failure, I say, what'd you learn? They're like, I don't know, but in Silicon Valley, if you go to an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist, he says, well, what did you learn? And, well, it turns out that this, so I feel like there's this joy of learning that through failure that is kind of difficult in Japan, at least to talk about. That person may have learned, but institutionally, we don't have that as learning. So I think risk-taking and failure is essential for learning, and I think kids like doing that. Kids, like a magician, is funny because you failed to get what was going on. And then it turns out it's funny if it's,
One quick thought, and I'll do this with especially younger students, like 18, 19 years old. I'll encourage them not to think of a startup as an organization that has a focus that will probably pivot, but instead think of you're creating a pivoting machine that listens and tests and experiments and eventually finds a focus. So I think what you said about alignment and culture is fundamentally what drives success in startups. If you don't have that incredible alignment, and I think having that kind of a culture of we're just going to go out and figure this out. I love this. I'm going to stick in my head. It turns out that is such a great line. So.
And do you think we can change the Japanese? Or you mentioned something like we need to adapt entrepreneurship to the Japanese style. What's that?
This is not a direct answer to that point, but so going back to the government thing. So one of the reasons why government officials cannot learn or cannot take risk is it's difficult by nature. It's difficult to set a specific target, and it's difficult to have specific purpose and like a goal to achieve. And without having that specific goal, I think your appetite to take risk is sort of like a low and very small. And without having that specific target, you don't have to learn actually. And so the government, Japanese government, have like a permanent employment system and a job rotation cycle, and that kind of make us to stop thinking that kind of to achieve the goal. And but in my personal case, I also worked on the establishing a new sovereign wealth fund. It's called like a Daigak fund. It's a joint fund. It's a $70 billion US fund. And for that case, I had a very specific target, and I did many things, and I took any measures that I can take, and my risk appetite was sort of bigger than usual, and I learned a lot in. But
you're an anomaly, right? like talking about Battushig's incentive. No one is incentivized to do what you do, other than if you're crazy or something, right? But why do you do that and no one else does? Because I think that's important to identify because there's this thing called positive deviance, which is Richard Pascal's method for change, which is instead of trying to change everybody, you find the deviants in the system that are doing the thing that you want, and you figure out what's making them behave differently. So I'm curious, what makes you decide to do that, even though you don't have the institutional incentive to be entrepreneurial?
Yeah, from the
Sorry,
beginning.
maybe self-awareness
So
isn't one of the things.
actually, so I'm working at the cabinet office right now, but I entered Ministry of Education and Science and Technology, and from the beginning, I wanted to support younger generation to unlock their capability and to achieve their goal and mission, and I more like a mission-oriented person, and I don't care about any personal promotion and protection of your home ministry, but other government officials do care about your promotion and how to protect your home ministry or your entity. But in my case, my incentive structure is sort of different. But from my view, there are more and more this kind of government officials nowadays, and yeah, I think
Well, that's one of my goals for this new global startup campus is to try to get those government officials who, when they start, some of them are entrepreneurial, but I think they become less and less so the longer they're in government. I don't know, and Masumi-san, you're probably a slightly more normal, but quite entrepreneurial. I mean, do you think that we can generalize this? And I'm also just curious, because you did a survey of entrepreneurship in Japan, if you have any views on this.
This might not be the perfect answer, direct answer as well, but I think the environment is changing, especially in the government as well. So, for example, when we talk about startup in space, we have 2 alumni from our office who are doing as a CEO of startup, space startup, and I heard they were recruited by venture capital to become a CEO. And I think those people are actually taking risks to be entrepreneurs. So I think environment is changing, and more people from government officials are now taking risks to become entrepreneurs, actually.
Then how about in academia? That was one of the things you were looking at, right? Is sort of PhD students and.
I think I was making comparison between MIT and the University of Tokyo, and one of the things I noticed is in Japan, people have a feeling that the researchers need to be a CEO to be an entrepreneur, but at MIT, I noticed they recognize there are a lot of pathway instead of becoming CEO, but they can actually play an important role as CTO as well. So those kind of.
I think it's a little bit of a coastal thing. I often say that MIT makes the open standards on top of which Stanford makes the monopolies. And I think, or the other way they say it is they often say that MIT is like the Marines and the Stanford is like the Army, because Army has leadership and Marines just like to fight, and so. But I don't. Do you think that's true? Because do you think Stanford has more CEO types coming out, and why? And is that something that we should care about? This might be unfair bias from.
No. I mean, because I started my career in Boston in venture. I was only there for a couple of years, and I remember when I came to the Valley, I felt like I'd gone on a time machine, in the sense that the power and the data and the control felt very much in the hands of venture capitalists in 1995 and 96 when I started. And when I got to Silicon Valley in 97, all the power was on the other side of the table. I think that the Valley tends to attract the most dissatisfied people in the species, and you can see it. You look at the origins of humans in Africa, and Silicon Valley. Whether you went, your ancestors went your guys' way or mine through Ireland and to the U.S. Silicon Valley is the furthest place you can go from the origins of man without going backwards. And so I think everybody gets there and okay, this is a great place to be around people that are just not satisfied with anything. And so that also, and there also isn't any sort of familiar ties, or so people just very open. And I think what ends up happening there is as you create some traction, with the early companies like Hewlett Packard and others, the more success you have, the more dissatisfied people move there. And then you end up having a system, whether it's CEOs, I think it's more like something you would see in a great baseball nation or a great soccer nation or basketball nation. You have just thousands of young people learning the business of taking a bag out into the world and selling something that the buyer doesn't even know they need. So you have thousands and thousands of them, and then you filter up and they become managers and they become directors and they become EVPs, and that becomes your talent resource. And that's where you see, I think you just see a system that attracts great players for that. And then it's a huge competitive advantage, I think, compared to the rest of the world.
So, Battushig, you moved from Silicon Valley to Japan to do your startup. Why, given this, why would you do that?
That's a very important question. And the easy answer, and kind of a superficial answer, is the quality of food versus the price ratio. That's amazing here. And better than San Francisco to a degree. But so that's kind of a personal reason. But another reason was I'm from Mongolia, and building a company in Japan. When I first met with Sho-san about 2 years ago, it was incredibly hard. And now, thanks to Sho-san's and Joi Ito-san's, like all of you guys' effort, it's getting easier. That I really feel it. Like there's more communities, there's more things to say. And but my main reason for coming here was that I think this room summarizes the state of the world right now. There's two dragons. One is red, the other one is blue. And that's how I felt in Silicon Valley when I was building an AI company. That world state of AI is just like that. And to which color you assign to which dragon is your choice, US versus China, that this divide is happening. And there needs to be a geopolitically neutral place that needs to exist in this AI ecosystem. And I think that Japan is one of the best places to fulfill that role in Asia Pacific. And I also have a governmental role. I advise Mongolian Prime Minister on national AI strategy. So I think a lot about national security perspective from geopolitically what's happening. And that even motivated me more to stay in Japan, which was Japan is one of the last stable democracies in Asia Pacific in this region. And the Japanese economy has been stagnant and slightly declining. And unless there's a new industry to make money, this economy will decline even more. And the danger of the weak Japanese economy is not just the worst of life, but also it has a huge implication for the rest of the Asia Pacific piece. Because the Japan is the last stronghold to keep the geopolitical balance in this region. And my country's independence depends on that. So if I wanted to put and pour my youth and energy to make any system better with my success, I thought like pouring it into Japan, therefore helping Mongolia made a lot of sense. And to all the Japanese people who are sitting here, I have one single message, which is to say, the strong and peaceful Japan is so integral piece of Asia Pacific peace. And it's in the interest of all the small countries in this region to keep the system stable. So we need to try very hard to make that happen. And I think entrepreneurship is one of the necessary steps to make that happen. And so that's my larger goal. And doing that while enjoying a good food seems like a fair deal to me. So I come here.
And I think the only... And I think the only solution to sort of getting older, sinking slightly, is either immigration and or more AI and robots. So I think we're sort of open to AI entrepreneurship. But you, Phil, you were kind of okay. Like you were painting Silicon Valley as the mecca of all entrepreneurship. But then why are you interested in helping unlock Japan? And what do we do here?
Well, I mean, a couple things. So again, you can get into this whole definition game. Is Silicon Valley a place, or is it a state of mind? That's been an old chestnut. And I think it is more of a state of mind. And I think it looks a lot like a religion that's growing globally. So you don't have to be in Silicon Valley physically anymore, like you used to be maybe 20 years ago. But I still think that there's a high concentration. There's a lot of talent there. I think that part of the reason I think Japan is so interesting is because, to this point of this incredibly stable, huge economy, so many innovative people that are sort of locked into these systems is interesting. But I think it's good to keep in mind that if you take the rise of another ecosystem like New York, if you look at the rise of New York as an ecosystem, it coincided with the rise of startups in areas like fintech and ad tech and media, where you had a concentration of depth of talent that would span out and say, I don't want to run news this way anymore. I want to do this with data and ad tech. And so I think Japan is its ecosystem, its startup ecosystem is going to reflect what the opportunities are for the whether it's a B2B, the companies that buy or consumer side. I think that's just a thing that's waiting to happen. And I always like to point out that if you think about it, probably you could argue like 70-80% of the business decisions in Japan are made in Tokyo, which means you can access the fourth largest economy in the world, with a Suica card. You can come here, you could do 5 tier 1 meetings in a day just by, as a starving entrepreneur, just by hopping around on the subway. Can't do that anywhere else. And the corporations are starting to think about how do they buy and implement new ideas.
I mean, you kind of have to know people to be able to do that, but
you can do it and meet with the wrong people. You can have it. It used to be about access to get a meeting with anybody here. If I go back to JAFCO days in the late '90s, it was a miracle to get a meeting with anybody, and we used to call it just a game of access. Now it's more of a signal to noise kind of success game of like, are you actually talking to the right person? Because you can get a meeting with any corporation in Japan now on the startup world. You're just probably talking to the wrong person.
Sho, do you want to talk about how the Global Startup Campus is going to fix everything?
Why didn't we just start there?
I think one of the challenges for Japan in terms of startup ecosystem is community and networks. So what's missing in Japan is networking for between founders and investors and Japan and the US and other countries. And our startup and our Global Startup Campus Initiative, we want to build a hub for founders and researchers, for investors, and not just for domestic one, but also global players as well. And also talking about entrepreneurship, I think entrepreneurship itself is not something taught in class, and it's more like experience and more like you need to kind of refer to how other people are behaving. And going back to my personal experience, so I had my mentor, my bosses, and who is very untraditional government official, and he can reach out to any senior level politicians and even prime ministers when he wanna achieve his goal. And but I kind of, when I look at how he behaves, I think I'm was feeling I can maybe do something similar. But the important thing is
like an unaligned AI.
Yeah, important thing is so, and also this is Chiba Tech an event, and probably the important thing is so. And I heard from Joi-san that Chiba Tech's course not just providing entrepreneur a course, but also Chiba Tech is providing many networks for students, and so they can have more opportunities to connect with many players, and that's very important. And so nowadays, many Japanese universities are providing entrepreneurship courses, but it's just curriculum courses, and even though you join that course, you cannot get connected with many players in Japan. That's Japanese situation, but we need to sort of change that situation, and we need to provide more opportunities and more networks for students and potential entrepreneurs and potential founders in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a sort of a general thing that Japanese are more institutional. I remember we went to a very beautiful museum, and Paula Antonelli asked, "Who's the architect?" And they said Takenaka Komuten, which is the construction company. No, but who designed the thing? Takenaka Komuten. You know, it's very anti-individualistic, and I think one of the problems with government efforts is they really want to create institutional ways to encourage entrepreneurship rather than human networks. And I think the idea of human networking feels a little bit unfair. You know, it's like, why should, and I think in general, startups are sort of unfair because some guy gets lucky and makes a lot of money and the person who was working with them in the lab doesn't, right? And I think that there's a real obsession with fairness, especially these days in Japan, and I think that's one of the challenges I see. But Masumi-san, yeah.
I think in terms of institutional things, I feel like when I was looking at University of Tokyo and its like entrepreneur supporting system and making a comparison between University of Tokyo and MIT, I feel like because Japanese people are obsessed about like demarcation and trying to avoid duplication. So in terms of the number of like entrepreneurship supporting system, there was huge difference between like two universities. And like, if you have a lot of program, there is a kind of like competition among services of like supporting system. So I think those kind of like competition was missing in Japan. And I feel like if there are tons of services, you can have more choice which fit you the most. So this is one of the program about like institutional things in Japan.
And Battushig, you were sort of mentioning that maybe somebody was helpful, but I mean, are you finding any of the entrepreneurship programs in Japan helpful? Or I mean, what's your view coming in? Is it would you recommend it to other entrepreneurs if they weren't obsessed with the food?
So it depends on which stage you are in. So I think there's like a lot of programs called like Antler startup programs that helps you if you're like a first-time entrepreneur who wants to set up your first company, then there's a lot of like services that helps you to set up a company, find you an investor, and also start up pitch competitions. That is super helpful. And I think again, like it has gotten exponentially better compared to 2 years. So I think you guys are doing a great job at that. And what I see a huge gap is for serial entrepreneurs who has built the company in Silicon Valley and sold the company in Silicon Valley, and that has been my case, and moving to Japan. And so the requirements are slightly different. Like the ideas are bit more sophisticated, like, and then raising amounts like initial seed, pre-seed money, the checks are much larger. And for those areas, I think there is almost no support existing right now. And I think that's a next natural stage of great avenue to start improving. And most of the time, the serial entrepreneurs, because they are more experienced, sometimes end up creating like these mid-sized companies that is profitable, that can service both Japanese market and also American market at the same time. So they create this stability and liquidity in the VC market to make sure that there's like a new startup that emerged that will be a next unicorn, right? So that I think is lacking.
Well, we had Reid Hoffman at a global startup campus meeting recently. There was a sort of similar thing. They said there's no growth capital in Japan. But he said a really interesting thing. He says, well, there are no growth opportunities. He says, as soon as you have growth opportunities, they'll come flying here from all over the world. So it's sort of a little bit of a chicken and an egg, you know. And I think if you're the only person here, and I think it's sort of true, there aren't very many serial entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley who are coming to Japan now. But I think it's a combination of the opportunity and the entrepreneur. But would you agree as a venture capitalist that it's just a matter of not having enough things to invest in?
100%. And I think two things that have happened in the past year, and I think you know both of them. We just announced last week the final close of AN Ventures, which is Ken Horn's firm. And there's another small firm called Rice Ventures, Taro Fukuyama, who is a Keio grad, but a Y Combinator entrepreneur, and he's building a cross-border fund. These funds that are doing seed stage investment in Japan, with an immediate global footprint becomes very important, because then they become the linchpins for the larger global funds to really rely on. They become kind of the signal processor. They can say, okay, the things they're doing are probably going to be higher quality. And for the big players to come in without a lot of experience in Japan, they need that kind of relationship on the ground, but also they're going to help create DNA out of the gate that is globally ready. And I think that's an issue that came up. I think Michael Carter brought that up at our event. Like, just simple things like, it's not that important structurally, but it's helpful to be registered in Delaware. It's helpful to be using GAAP accounting. If anytime you put an obstacle in place that someone flies into Japan and has to look and go, I don't quite understand how this structure works, already at a handicap to a company they might be looking at in Denmark or in Brazil or whatever, if they're looking at doing something that's far away.
I'm going to aggregate a few questions that I saw from Slido, but because we have about less than 5 minutes left. But so it is getting better, I think. I mean, so specifically, the Global Startup Campus now is starting a bunch of fellowships to take. Would you want to explain it? Because I think some people are asking, how do they get involved? What can we do? But there's a fellowship program people can sign up for going both ways, right?
Yeah. So one of the programs under Global Startup Campus Initiative is a fellowship program, and send Japanese talent and select Japanese talent to send them to USVCs. So for now, we are targeting a postdoc level, and then we are also bringing US postdocs to Japan. And our view is we need to have more of younger researchers who understand how US works, and with also network with US ecosystem and researchers and investors. And I think this sort of interaction is very important for the ecosystem perspective. And we need to have more of younger talent.
We'll have events and gatherings and stuff, and I know. So you guys have this conference, and you have a foundation here, right? That's doing. And do you want to describe a little bit about what your foundation's doing?
Yeah, it's called 11KS. We funded it with a few $1 million last year, and it's pretty simple. I'm borrowing a lot of what I learned at the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, and I would say our mantra is we want to be able to listen to interesting questions on innovation education and then answer them with programs. And we do programs at 3 levels. We do media level programs like the book, or we do expert network programs like Unlock Japan, and then we do a lot of curriculum development. So we're trying to bring the curriculum of the Stanford class into any of the universities here that would want to put it to work.
And then for SDS, Samantha Bates and I are working on an entrepreneurship course. We're stealing a lot of material from your course, and we'll have that from April next year, and it'll be in English.
My course is a Creative Common.
Thank you.
And it was started that way, intentionally. So you're not stealing anything.
But I at least I intend to have it open to anyone, so it's not just our students. So that's another way you can interact. But I don't know, but do you have any suggestions for places people who want to be entrepreneurs here in Japan should go? Or talk to? I mean, what do you have any tips? Don't come. Well, Shibuya has a startup, I think Toku, and they have a startup program. But you said it was difficult to use, right? Is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
So in terms of should go, I find talking to other founders who are coming to Japan was the most helpful thing, because all these government programs and everything has the best intention of the entrepreneur to help them at heart. But one thing I know is these people haven't built the companies by themselves yet. So they even though they want to help, their advice is sometimes just not enough because they haven't built a company before. So talking to people who actually built a company in Japan was the best thing. So coming to this kind of events and coming to it a founder-oriented events was the most helpful thing that you can possibly do. And another thing was I sometimes just go to Shimakitazawa, and there is like a station, Shimakitazawa station, and you can talk to pretty much any Japanese person and ask and interview them about what's their problem, what do they need. Like you can do idea validation. A lot of people are under this impression that Japanese people are shy. But one thing I discovered was if you just explain your true purpose and ask them for a feedback, the people at the station usually, even if it's Friday on 7 p.m., they are super open to provide their feedback. So I find the concentration of people and opportunities in Japan to be great. And so come build in Japan, but talk to more founders who is situated in Japan. So that's what I think.
Any last comments before we close?
Just to jump on this real quick, because yes, I do think that it's a challenge to do a startup here, but it's a challenge to do a startup in Silicon Valley. It's a different kind of challenge, but it's not like the streets are not running with gold, and it's not easy. What I pay attention to, and I could see this in like a place like Berlin when it became a hotbed. A lot of entrepreneurs moved to Berlin for much of the same reason, because it's a really cool city, and the entrepreneurs are selfish, and they want what they want, and so they moved there, and it became a hotbed of talent. We know a lot of people who are coming here who are accomplished and talented, and I think it's going to be a key driver for success here. So I think if you're determined to start a company, you probably don't pay attention to the weather conditions that much. Whether if you want to start your company in Japan and you're a talented entrepreneur, there's a way. You'll figure it out.
There's always a way.
There's always a way.
Yeah. And in a weird way, there's less competition, right? I mean, and I see that. I mean, some companies get really big really fast because it's kind of like surfing tidal waves. I mean, it's risky and it's hard, but once you punch through, there's less. You can kind of roll things up. I think, at least for a while.
Is today a good day to talk about tidal waves? Because they're like a huge
Well,
earthquake being predicted.
We're fine.
Yeah, we're high. We're okay.
We were thinking about inviting that guy, but then I said it's only two outcomes. Either he's here and he's wrong, so it's not interesting, or he's right and it's also not interesting. But should you have a last comment?
I just wanted to add, I did a consumer startup in LA, and distributing the app in the US is so hard, but in Japan, launching something is much easier because of the density. But either to a corporate sales or to a consumer sales, it's way easier. And just as one last remark was that the theme here is like intradisciplinary research, intradisciplinary institution. And one thing I discovered was the kind of a problem that I'm working on right now is you can't put a category on it, but because it's not quite SaaS, it's not quite consumer. So it's kind of like an interdisciplinary. And I think that's the most exciting indication that you're working on a new technology wave. And because of that, every discipline that exists now has been interdisciplinary at some point before they emerge. So I think this SDS initiative, I hope it will create a lot of interdisciplinary things and establish new disciplines in Japan. So that's my hope. So super excited about that as well.
Thank you very much.